Our next presenter, Danielle Kreeger, Ph.D., is an ecologist with more than 30 years of experience working as a research scientist and educator. She currently serves as Senior Science Director for the Partnership for the Delaware. In addition to her work with PDE, she also maintains an appointment as an Associate Research Professor at the Academy of Natural Sciences of Drexel University. Danielle Kreeger holds a Ph.D. in Fisheries from Oregon State University, a master's degree in Marine Studies from the University of Delaware, and a bachelor's degree in Marine Biology from Penn State University. Thank you, Danielle.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm delighted to help wrap up the Restore America's Estuaries conference. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but I wanted to pull back a little bit in this presentation and think about this question of the future of nature-based shoreline protection, and really look at it through the living shoreline lens, but at maybe a broader viewpoint of where we're heading in society, and what does this nature-based infrastructure, nature-based movement really mean for us, and how does that reflect on the promise of shoreline protection, novel new approaches. So what I want to do is look through this lens of living shorelines, and I'm going to be talking about probably a lot of example data from the Delaware Estuary and some of our projects working with many partners, but really trying to get at this question of the future. So I'm not going to show a lot of data. Well, I'm going to cut to the chase. So to me, I tend to be an optimistic person, but I think that the future is very bright for nature-based infrastructure in general, but particularly for shoreline protection approaches that rely on natural organisms and natural features. And there's really three reasons why I'm optimistic. One, which is the unfortunate sad fact of the need with climate change and with continuing development. We have to do more. We just have to do more to sustain the critical life-sustaining ecosystem services on which society depends. I think that economics are going to drive a lot of the change and really spur investment in these approaches. I'm going to talk a bit about that. And then, as we've seen at this meeting, a lot of opportunity for innovation with nature-based infrastructure. However, the future isn't just all paved and clear. I think there's some caveats I want to talk about as well before I wrap up. So using the Delaware Estuary as an example, and using coastal wetlands as an example habitat, of course, I'm preaching to the choir. We all understand the value of these habitats for flood protection, but also, they tend to be the kidneys of the system for pollutants. They're the fish factories. They're the best habitats for carbon capture that we have. They're important for, many socioeconomic reasons related to natural areas in terms of birding and kayaking and so forth. And so on the right here, you see a map of the lower part of the Delaware system, red being salt marshes, yellow being brackish marshes, green, these little green swivels are freshwater tidal marshes. So this is a very wetland dominated system fringed on both shorelines with a diversity of wetland types. And when you think about all these different benefits of these habitats, these ecosystem services, they really stack up quickly. But unfortunately, if you actually go from the map and set boots out there, you've been on some field trips yesterday, for those of you who aren't in this area, I'm sure in your habitats, your watersheds that you have traveled from, you've probably seen the same thing, but almost anywhere you look around our system, this is what you're going to see. Massive amounts of shoreline erosion, particularly along these fringing wetlands. And we know from our Mid-Atlantic Coastal Wetland Assessment Project, working with many partners, that this adds up. I mean, our State of the Estuary indicator-based reports, where we use coastal wetlands as one of our 60 indicators. We're tracking loss rates of these coastal wetlands that are pretty substantial, about an acre per day. Shown on the left is sort of the total change in acreage in square miles since 1996. A little out of date here on the last point, but you see the trend. And then in terms of the net loss in terms of square miles, and this is the Delaware Estuary tidal and non-tidal wetlands, and this is Barnegat. Barnegat's not shown as steep of a drop in terms of square miles, but that's simply because it's a smaller system, so it's a scaling factor. You're seeing loss of these wetlands at a terrific rate. And the wetlands that remain are not really in good condition. So this is from our rapid probabilistic surveys in different subwatershed areas of Delaware Estuary and Barnegat. The red here are severely stressed parcels. The yellow are moderately stressed. So most of our wetlands are in impaired or degraded condition relative to references. And that's often a precursor of loss. And it's also means lower ecosystem service flows from those habitats when they're degraded. So, you know, of course, most of the interest and the main driver here is sea level rise. I mean, in our system, we have channel deepening, bigger ships, more standing waves. We have a lot of nutrient loadings that impair our marshes' ability to keep pace with sea level rise. We have sediment budget issues, sediment management issues, but the main driver is sea level rise. And in this plot, you can just see data from the last 10 or so years, whether these marshes are changing elevation. The dark blue are salt marshes grading to freshwater tidal marshes. And so it's particularly the salt marshes where we're worried about them keeping pace with sea level rise. Of course, looking into the crystal ball, sea level rise rate is increasing non-linearly. And you know, we're at 4 to 5 millimeters now at Cape May, but obviously even with the best case mitigation for carbon emissions, the rate of sea level rise is going to eclipse 10 millimeters per year in our lifetimes, most of our lifetimes. And that is considered by many wetland ecologists as a likely tipping point where we're going to see colossal losses of our marshes. So the need is very steep. And, you know, the good news is we have solutions. We have living shorelines. We have these techniques like thin layer sediment application that are increasingly in vogue in our area. But, you know, this is going to become like beach replenishment. So let's say you have a particular coastal wetland that's delivering some critical flood protection service or, you know, fish or bird habitat, and you want to sustain that wetland, you're going to have to more frequently do thin layer or some tactic to intervene, because if the black line here is sea level rise, you know, and initially you have this much elevation capital that wanes over time because the marshes are not keeping pace. And ideally you catch it in time, you elevate it before it drowns, but then you're basically buying years of elevation capital. You know, and you're going to have to repeatedly do that and more frequently. And where you can do this is really limited. It's where you have dredging opportunities of the right sediment grain size with the cost, you know, benefit ratio driving the project. So it's certainly not a magic bullet, but it is a promising tool in theory. Of course, it has to be thin layered. You can't kill the plants and all of those kinds of good things. But currently, so that's the future. The future is we're very concerned about marshes keeping pace with sea level rise. But right now, more than 90% of those wetland losses shown in that image on the left here are driven at the edge. I mean, most of our losses right now are due to edge erosion, not platform drowning. So I don't quite understand currently. There's so much interest in thin layer, which is appropriate. I think we have opportunities, but there's just less investment in edge protection to save wetlands in the same way that we're saying it with beneficial use of, you know, using thin layer. So, you know, and we have lots of data to support this. This is from MACLA as well. You know, in a natural marsh system, you're always seeing some actual natural erosion, but that's balanced by natural accretion. You know, most of our systems, if not all, are experiencing net erosion. And that erosion rate can be, you know, well more than a meter per year. That's the average. We have areas that are losing 10 to 15 meters of edge per year. There's lots that goes on with that. I'm just, you know, some of you in the crowd are going to say, oh no, she's going to talk about rib mussels. Because I've been working on this species, one of my pet favorites. Rib mussels, Buchensia demissa, are naturally most abundant at the edge of these marshes and in the tidal creeks. Current rates of edge erosion, we're losing, we estimate, more than 300,000 mussels a day. Well, they filter a lot of water, and that has benefits for water quality. So we're currently losing filtration capacity by the species of more than 5 million liters every single day. And what does that mean? Well, those particles, those mussels are feeding, help those marshes keep pace with sea level rise. They capture, this is our estimates of, almost 100 metric tons of total suspended solids per hectare per year. Where you don't have red mussels, you're not getting that benefit. And this varies a lot depending on the nitrogen loadings, but on average, the particulate nitrogen in those particles amounts to those animals filtering almost 500 kilograms of particulate nitrogen per hectare per year. That means something to water quality managers. Once you lose all these wetlands and you lose the associated organisms like mussels that are helping you maintain water quality, will you need to set more stringent nutrient criteria for the watershed to offset the loss of these nature-based natural services? So Shoreline Edge is currently the front line. It's the front line for marsh loss. It's the front line for our ecosystem service decline. And, we really need to be focusing on the edge, and it's not going to stop. So I just talked about this. Oysters, freshwater mussels, red mussels are just one component of the system, but they're really important when it comes to water filtration. And of course, getting back to flood protection and, shoreline protection, in this neck of the woods, Hurricane Sandy was our bellwether storm. And, along the Gulf, there's other storms, but it's become increasingly clear that flood and storm damage is reduced where you still have your buffering coastal wetlands. So, and that has a lot of values for society, flood insurance premiums and all of that. So what I see coming is this whole field of ecological economics is going to continue to expand, and increasingly the need for these services, not just on the bayshore, rural areas, but Philly and Camden and Wilmington, Chester, Pennsylvania, the flood protection services are going to increasingly be driving investment in these nature-based approaches, as well as all the other services that I just touched on. And, when you get closer to urban populations, it becomes really important. Philadelphia takes its drinking water from the tidal part of the estuary. It's just fresh water, fishing, swimming, and so forth. So been focused on wetlands, forests and other habitats are obviously really important as well. In our State of the Estuary reports, we track in 40 square miles with forest loss in the last 10 years. I mean, all of these habitats are in decline for various reasons. And the loss of natural infrastructure, natural systems needs to at least be offset as wherever we can get green, wherever we can get it with nature-based infrastructure. And this includes things below the waterline too, the hidden gardens, the submerged aquatic vegetation, the shellfish communities, and so forth. So, I'm with the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, one of the NEPs. And of course, like the NEAR system, like the Restore America's Estuaries larger group, it's our job to think holistically about all of these different ecosystem services. And I think increasingly in the future, to really spur investment in living shorelines and some of their approaches, we need to start thinking beyond our silos, beyond, specific resource issues, and think collectively about how we can combine or really tally up all the different benefits and try to monetize those. It's what I consider to be an ecological Manhattan project, because there are downsides to doing this monetization of nature, big downsides, but it is the way it's going to go. It really has to be for us to sustain lives and livelihoods. And this requires really a more holistic ecosystem-based management, ecosystem-based restoration approach. And that's where I think the groups like the NEPs can help. Looking through this lens of natural capital, it needs to be recognized that these declining habitats, particularly along the edge, particularly along shorelines, their decline means lost services, which has cost to society. And particularly coastal wetlands, because if you stack the natural capital services of any of the habitats in the mid-Atlantic, the coastal wetlands are always going to be on top. They just deliver, from carbon capture right on down to flood protection. So that's the bad news. I think change in the future and investment in these systems is going to continue to increase because of the need increasing. But I also think we should recognize that there is increasingly more brain trust being marshaled to this issue. We have all these wonderful engineers now focused on it. We have policymakers and, of course, scientists. And, just the presentations at this meeting, all the innovation you're seeing with nature-based approaches and living shorelines. We're expanding the types of living shorelines. We're expanding the places that we can work. We heard yesterday about the project we're trying to help get on the ground in the freshwater tidal part of the urban landscape. And, there's just, you deal with different energies and different functional dominant species in a very site-based, innovative way. So I think we have a lot of opportunity to continue to innovate. And I wish I was younger, because I tell students, this is a real opportunity even for private sector to really, invent new approaches. So because of the increasing need, because of the shifting economics, and because of all this innovation and opportunity, I'm very hawkish on nature-based investment in terms of looking in the crystal ball. But I do want to talk a little bit about the keys to success, or the caveats. And first of all, this is nature, and we need to flow with nature. We heard about this before, and Doug Janik touched on it as well. Nature doesn't like straight lines. I heard, John Miller talk about that. Engineers love these sexy new projects. I mean, no straight lines, right? Well, that's cool, because we're going to need that. We need to go with the flow of nature. And let's start with, the latitudinal shifts in species assemblages. We're not in zone 6 anymore in our area, so we have a longer growing season. There are some pluses to that. When Dave Bushek and I first sort of got the Delaware Estuary Living Shoreline Initiative off the ground 15 years ago, we targeted rib mussels because at the time we were looking at all these cool living shoreline projects being done in the Carolinas, think with oysters, intertidal oysters, but we couldn't really do intertidal oysters yet because of winter freeze kill. But that's 15 years ago. All of a sudden we have intertidal oysters in Delaware Bay. That's a new opportunity. So yeah, we're still working with our rib mussels, but now we're really increasingly working oysters into our living shoreline designs in the saltwater parts of the system. So we're going with the flow. We also need to really understand the science and understand the ecology, and not bypass the science. We need to embrace the science. And here's just one example from our projects. We learned, well, through our MAQUA program, we've been working to identify the optimal growing ranges for the functional dominant plants like Spartina. And this differs in different parts of the Delaware Estuary. Delaware Estuary compared to Barnegat Bay, the gray bars here are the mean tidal prism. As Martha mentioned earlier, it's macrotidal Delaware Estuary, more microtidal in Barnegat. And where you want to plant your plants in a living shoreline project is going to vary. And if you don't really understand where these optimal elevations are, the optimal growing ranges of the plants, you're going to have some issues, which we had right off the bat. This is a paired installation of sort of our bio-based approach to the core log approach that Dave Bushek and, well, Rutgers and PD got off the ground a number of years ago in the Morris River. These installations were set in exactly the same way at exactly the same elevation. But over time, one flourished and one did not. And if we weren't monitoring, if we weren't scientifically assessing exactly what was going on with the physical, biological, chemical conditions, we wouldn't have probably understood why this cusp failed. It failed because it was a little muddier there. And the materials that we had placed out settled by about 10 centimeters, dropping out of the optimal growing range of the Spartina. So, we adaptively managed the project. We quickly went out and put a second terrace deck on here, and within no time at all, the one on the right looked like the one on the left. So there's several key lessons learned, and I've heard it in many other talks. You need to be understanding what's going on, and you need to intervene and adapt based on your monitoring. If you're just building it and walking away, you're not going to have all your projects succeed. You'll get lucky once in a while. We also need to understand, obviously, the geomorphology and the hydrodynamics, again, avoiding straight lines. I mean, nature doesn't like straight lines. If you look at that plot. So you design to speed bump and the hydrodynamics, and you need to understand, the fetches and the currents. And you really need to design for dissipating energy rather than reflecting energy, maximizing interstitial spaces. And, these habitats are co-beneficial or mutually beneficial. So, shallow subtidal beds of SAV, shallow subtidal oyster reefs at low tide have effects, and there's biogeochemical interactions with the intertidal habitats. So if you can work toward a multiple habitat approach to living shorelines, and what we sometimes call habitat mosaic, we think that that can lead to a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. We need to understand succession. Again, plug for science and plug for ecologists. A lot of projects look their worst right after installation. It takes a while sometimes. In some cases, you get what you want right away. In some cases, it takes a long time. For instance, colonization by shellfish. Project put in the Mississippi in 2014. Even 4 or 5 years later, we're still increasing the oyster coverage on this project. So if our goals were set to, on a 2-year, grant timeline, we would never have really started to see the actual maturation, if you will, of the project. So you need to allow time and understand how fast things might, mature. And the other factor, which I think is backing off of specific projects and thinking of the system as a whole. Sediment supply is important. Obviously, do you need fill, or can you rely on natural accretion to backfill your project site if that's part of your design? The Delaware Estuary, currently the sediment budget is really screwed up. I'm just going to say it bluntly. It's in balance, but because 50% of the sediments coming in river runoff are supplying the sediment budget, but formerly that was a much higher percentage. We've had decreasing amounts of sediment coming into our system from tributaries. Fully half of the sediment supply right now in the Delaware Estuary is stemming from eroding marshes. Well, okay, so some of that TSS that washes out naturally deposits on top of marshes, helping them keep pace. So this is the whole conundrum of marsh cannibalism, where you're basically maintaining some marsh at the expense of your marsh, the whole complex. And if you're not getting your landward migration enough to compensate for those edge losses, you are in a net loss scenario, and that's where we're at. We're projecting maybe at best 50% of our marsh loss at the edge can be compensated by marsh migration inland. So we're going to see this net loss continue. So we have this prospect of putting dredged sediment from the channels back on top of the marsh, and we can potentially use coarser grain sediments at the edge. But the point here is that if you don't understand this dynamic, you're going to be increasing the frequency of maintenance dredging simply because the increasing amounts of marsh erosion. And so if you're only relying on thin layer, that's really not going to help you slow down this process or cut your costs here. You might cut your costs by not having to ferry the dredge material to a CDF. But why not try to intersect at the root of the problem, which is at the edge? This source of sediments from eroding marsh edges, if you can just stabilize that, you might be able to decrease your dredging frequency or dredging costs. And, and that isn't that what, I think would be the game. But, everything is looked at on a project by project basis and not through the context of regional sediment management. So that's a plug for RSM and understanding the science of the whole and not just the site. The other plug I want to put in is for monitoring. I mean, again, these projects, these living shorelines are gardens that need to be tended. That's the way they are. It's just like the garden out in front of your house. If you have a service contract for a gardening firm, they're not coming in, planting something, walking away, coming back 30 years later. They're tending they're tending your garden. And I think that to be able to understand what's happening on your project and have interventions that can maybe nip a problem in the bud and avoid a failure you need to basically have more monitoring than we would have had on traditional infrastructure. And so, clarifying what you're monitoring for, your goals of your project, monitoring metrics designed for that, and then using the monitoring data to adaptively intervene is, I think, necessary. And I think it can really save a lot of money in the long run from avoiding failed projects. So, just a couple quick snapshots. Our original bio-based living shorelines, PD and Rutgers worked on the goals, stemming loss of wetlands and promoting cleaner water through shellfish. This is in the Morris River, New Jersey. To be able to assess those outcomes, we needed to monitor our projects. Of course, these are research restoration projects, science projects, so we're going to do this. But without paired controls to compare to our treatment, we would not have been able to really say a whole lot, because the services or the controls continue to erode landward. And by sort of holding the line seaward, we haven't really increased a lot of acreage, but we've avoided losing acreage. And we would only know that by looking at an untreated area. Hybrid living shoreline, this is our Mississippian project here. The goals were slightly different. We wanted to sort of attenuate the wave energy eroding the shore paired with the bio-based approach. Again, a big target. A lot of our funding, by the way, is from clean water or water quality sources, not really coastal resilience sources, which is another plug for diversifying these ecosystem services that we're thinking about. Anyway, through some pretty intensive monitoring of this project, we were able to document that we did in fact get more water filtration through the shellfish community, but it took a while. We did capture sediment. We did, achieve our goals. Josh Moody this morning talked about the living shoreline feasibility model. Working together across sectors, across state lines, across the watershed, to think about strategic placement of projects that are goal driven, and really looking at which sites, if you have 10 candidate sites, which are the top 2 or 3 where the project may succeed. So using these science-based tools can really also save money. And then finally, a plug for translating. We tend to do project by project and we write our reports, but looking through a broader ecosystem service lens with multiple stacked ecosystem services, I think will increasingly be helpful in terms of justifying continued investment by grant funders. And I think other sectors are going to come into this over time. So for instance, we've been just playing around comparing a hybrid attenuating saltwater living shoreline to a freshwater tidal living shoreline in Philadelphia. And just rolling this all up a little bit, we've estimated what the uplift is in terms of shellfish mediated water filtration and how much nitrogen is in the water column at those sites, and basically what would be your net ecological uplift in terms of nitrogen removal services. And what would be the cost per linear foot, or the cost for the project for doing that. And so what we rolled it up and found that, okay, the rural project is a bit cheaper. You can get more nitrogen removal down in Delaware Bay per linear foot than up in the freshwater tidal urban corridor. And if you're just interested in only that, you might think, okay, well, I'm going to invest in this over this. But there's other factors to consider. For instance, in an urban landscape, shown here at the top, this is the lower Schuylkill River, where we started to put in a freshwater tidal living shoreline, and we're thinking of multiple habitats. You're not only hitting your ecological goals of, say, water filtration and maybe ecological enhancement, but you're now putting a project in closer to the sources of the pollutants, closer to impairment areas. That has a geospatial angle that we might not be thinking about project by project. Also, in an urban landscape, you have opportunities to engage more people. Maybe it's citizen science or outreach programs. And then, of course, most of those waterfront areas in urban landscapes are the areas where there's been a lot of environmental injustice through history. And we think that if you are we're all increasingly trying to work this in, there is more opportunity, obviously, to address social equity issues in an urban landscape. So once you add those additional benefits of these projects on top of the ecological benefits, then you might be able to justify that, okay, it costs more, but the benefits are more. So the return on investment is equal if you monetize all of those services. So that's where we're going. And then I think the last scientific plug here is for this concept of ecological compounding that I touched on earlier. This is a living shoreline in front. This is an untreated area behind. This is about 8 years after the project was installed. And what you're seeing is that, okay, we've maybe increased 0.1 hectare here by building the marsh out, but we've avoided this marsh continued to erode year after year after year back here. And so when you have your monitoring paired control, you can say that the net change in acreage relative to an untreated alternative continues to grow year after year after year if you continue to adaptively maintain that shoreline. And so there's this loss avoidance piece of the return on investment calculation. And, you can't really get at this without looking at the untreated alternative through monitoring. So anyway, I just going to wrap up. I want to talk about what I see happening, which is a major paradigm shift. I think you all know this. Nature-based infrastructure is new and different. But I think a few keys to success are going to be this continued movement toward having ecologists be paired with the engineering community that has traditionally been greenlighting and designing projects. I mean, without understanding some of the things I just touched on, you're more likely to not succeed. I think we need to elevate monitoring because it's not just to be able to quantify and communicate the outcomes from your project, but these projects are gardens that need to be tended. So monitoring is actually a critical part of maintaining a successful project over time. There's different sectors here intersecting, with engineers and ecologists, and increasingly, I think it's going to be bankers and insurance companies getting involved. So something like the NOAA terminology, discount service acre years to quantify ecosystem service flows, and think about ecological compounding on all those concepts. We need to develop a common vernacular for how we can work together. And then I think for like marine contractors, building it and walking away like a bulkhead versus a service contract like your gardening contract. How do we find ways to monetize and incentivize sustained investments so that these projects can be perpetuated? And finally, of course, we all know, permitting is the traditional permitting model for like a 5-year project is just not going to work with many of these sustained gardens that we're creating and hope to maintain for long time periods. Because I think that what we're seeing with nutrient trading markets, carbon markets, flood protection markets, insurance, these markets are going to continue to develop. And, I think a lot of the goals that we're looking for on these projects, like stemming erosion, the more we can diversify those goals and include ecological uplift, the more we can link it to these opportunities that I think are going to be driving future economies. And the more we can stack the natural capital values and talk about that, the more I think certain types of investments are really going to be easier and easier to find funding for. Think about, the Army Corps and the mission of navigation versus the mission of ecological restoration, and connecting the dollars, the economic ROI of a navigation project to the ecological enhancement, connecting those silos and then having the ecological enhancement be worth something. All this has to happen. And then to link things like beneficial use and regional sediment management and maybe dredging avoidance, cutting the frequency of dredging tied to a living shoreline investment. Those kinds of connecting the dots, I think, need to happen to really fully capitalize on the opportunities in front of us. And of course, carbon. I mean, an eroding marsh is losing a huge chunk of old carbon in terms of peat. So you have this big upfront outwelling. A marsh will turn in from a net carbon sink to a major carbon source very quickly with erosion. Are we telling that story? Are we guiding our carbon investments, our carbon capture and natural infrastructure, understanding that erosion, shoreline erosion is a major issue, undercutting your carbon capture if you don't deal with that? And finally, I think it's important to translate, as I mentioned earlier, for like nutrient management, nitrogen management. This nature-based infrastructure, I think, is really under regarded in terms of how important it is. And if you lose these natural habitats, or you don't work to offset the losses with nature-based infrastructure, we will need to set more stringent nutrient criteria. And that means more costs on businesses and industry. So wrapping up, I think we've come a long way from traditional strictly gray infrastructure to working towards nature-based infrastructure. I think we're right here. We haven't yet gotten where we're going to go, but we will have to get there because society as a whole, we need clean air, we need clean water, we need more flood protection in these changing times. And so we really will need to get greener. And I really do believe that the markets are going to follow. So the future of nature-based shorelines, I think, is very robust. Unfortunately, it's driven mainly by an increasingly high need to sustain these critical services in the face of climate change and development. I think it's also, I'm optimistic because we have a lot of smart people thinking about this stuff now. And I think a lot of young people coming into the field, there's just a tremendous, almost unlimited opportunity for innovation, getting green wherever you can get it, from urban, we're going to go way beyond rain barrels and rain gardens in urban landscapes, way beyond that. How do we get there? Success, although I think the success is going to be faster if we can really stick true to, valuing the science and trying to upsize our monitoring commitments. Obviously sharing outcomes at symposia like this Restore America's Estuaries meeting, and then working on removing the bottlenecks related to permitting or funding, and of course increasingly focusing on just rolling with it, adapting, following the flow of nature, not trying to oppose the natural flow of nature, and being responsive to things that we can't even predict today. We need to be fleet of foot. And then this whole movement in nature-based living shoreline protection, nature-based infrastructure, I think is part of this ecological, what I call the Ecological Manhattan Project, that it's going to be part of a whole market transformation. I think a societal transformation that we're on the cusp of, where it's not just oil and water and the main natural resources, and energy. It's going to be really driven by clean water, clean air, protection, resilience, and increasingly, I think we're going to see big insurance companies and big banks and others getting into the business, getting into our business. And so we need to be prepared for that. And we need to take some precautions against some of the dangers of that, which I'm not going to talk about here. So that's it.